So what better place to start than at Jubilee, the modern day great debate stage, often called rage bait content if you look at the comments. Some of the videos, sure, I'd say like OnlyFans girls versus mother, kids versus criminals, that's kind of a weird one. They do feel like clickbait, but I think their political debates are in a league of their own. They're at least trying to find common ground and have honest debates with both sides. And in my opinion, it's a far cry from most of the grifting content. They featured many of our favorite names in politics. Charlie Kirk, Mehdi Hassan, Ben Shapiro, Destiny. And they featured real politicians too. Ro Khanna, James Talarico, recently Wes Moore did a great episode. They let the people confront politicians face to face. And you gotta respect that. So when it comes to their political content, I think Jubilee is a little less clickbait than people give them credit for, a little less rage bait than people give them credit for. Times are so divisive already, all you really need to do is bring together both sides and you'll get the drama. The fireworks will come. But that's no excuse to stop trying. I'm sure many of us find that content fascinating anyway. It's a win-win. As far as I can tell, they have done their job in getting informed people who genuinely believe in what they say. For the most part. We've watched the cast of characters change over time. I'm sure many of us have our favorites. But one man's master debate wizard is just another man's insufferable weirdo. You probably find yourself often wondering how they even let some of these people on the show. But what's even worse is that those same people often have plenty of online supporters. I always find it shocking how many supporters they have. But I think it all highlights how hard it is to have honest political debates nowadays. Some of them treat it as a reality show, for sure. They know they are not there to change minds or make good arguments, but to just signal to their own side, for more exposure and followers. Some of them may just be grifting their way to the top, for sure. It's getting harder to tell the difference, unfortunately. So I'd like to review the recent new Jubilee format that they call Checkmate, because I think the recent episode perfectly demonstrates how political conversations play out in everyday life and online. It was a great microcosm of the overall state of American politics, so what better place to start? So the format allowed for live fact-checking, and as you can see, the viewers were stoked as hell. So I'm not going to spoil the episode, and I suggest you watch the full thing, because it was very interesting, but essentially, here's a few things that panned out. Of course, it all became about getting points. Both sides would jump at the opportunity if someone on the other side misspoke or made a claim that was clearly too broad to back up. There were a few times where the person arguing doesn't even agree with their own statement before they do the fact check. At least they did start to let them clarify as the episode went on, though. It's like they were learning as they went. The fact-checking as a whole was by far the most interesting part of the whole ordeal. As one might expect, as soon as one side takes a commanding lead, the other side starts blaming the fact-checks and they become under heavy scrutiny. There was this odd feeling for a while, and this is just speculation here of course, but it started to feel like they were trying to keep the points close at times. Eventually, this is what culminated in the most interesting part of the video. And the reason I decided to make this video, when one of the fact checkers actually stormed off set. So let's unpack that moment now. The claim was made that the El Salvador president is a dictator, and it came up false because there's no legal classification of a dictator. He was elected, and El Salvador remains a democracy. At that point, they paused, and there was an awkward moment. The director accused the fact-checker of editorializing, which seems like a nice way of calling her bias. The fact-checker said, "You have to remain neutral." And it sounded like both sides were accusing the other of being biased. And this kind of speaks to what I said earlier, in a way, why there was this strange feeling that they were trying to keep the points closer. This moment is worth 1,000 words because it illustrates how the facts themselves have become so controversial. It's not just a Jubilee issue, it's a symptom of a wider misinformation virus, I think, that has existed a long time before they have. So I'm a little torn on how this went ultimately. On one hand, is a fact checker not there for fact checking? It's not a really good look for the director to override the opinion of a fact checker who's there for fact checking. I do assume that this was a group effort. They had a small team of fact checkers perhaps, and there was most likely debate among them. And in defense of the directors, they were right that you can't always have the crew arguing amongst themselves. Of course, the show must go on. They have a plan and a vision, they want to see it through. From a purely theatrical and content creator point of view, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt for that. It's still just not a good look. So, I decided to do a little bit of my own digging on it to see if the El Salvador president is a dictator. But generally, a dictator is an authoritarian, someone with the ability to exercise absolute control over their population. Its modern usage generally is used to describe a leader who abuses an extraordinary amount of personal power. They can rise through shows of force, often will oppress their opposition heavily, and comes in the form of one large dominant party, and not necessarily a single individual, but the party he leads. They're pretty synonymous with spreading propaganda, election manipulation, and show trials or fake trials to consolidate their power. So how does Bukele, fit this definition? Well, immediately upon researching, I saw that he had declared himself the world's coolest dictator. As a young, populist guy. That's not really a good start, to be honest. You are seeing a heavy military presence, police trucks, armored vehicles in the streets, and even tanks, things that are more synonymous with a country that's at war. And all sorts of human rights organizations are saying that human rights are being eroded, although their crime rates are plummeting as a result. Speaking of which, he's proudly overseeing one of the world's most notorious and dangerous prisons, that Sikot prison. When it comes to the propaganda side of things, I've read that his vice president proclaimed that in El Salvador they had passed 500 days without a single homicide incident, which doesn't even pass the smell test. So, it's not a great start when he calls himself a dictator, although he does appear to have genuinely wide popular support and appeal across Latin America. For a while, this term was trending. What a beautiful dictatorship. But being popular and having legitimately won elections before does not exclude one from becoming or being labeled a dictator. Am I crazy on that? Military coups and government takeovers by force are of course one, and I think one far less common way of becoming a dictator and obtaining power. Think of any dictator right now and tell me whether or not they had pretty wide popular support at the beginning of their careers. That's almost always the case. So Jubilee, in my opinion, has already screwed up by treating those two as mutually exclusive. I guess they assume you cannot be called a dictator after winning an election, which is very convenient if you're a dictator and you can run a fake election. Then there's the no legal classification of a dictator. What does that even mean? Who is asking for a legal classification of dictator when we can just use historical examples and definitions relating them to how he functions? So honestly, after reading that fact check, I can't totally blame the fact checker for leaving. The way they went about it was a little weird. It's my humble opinion that the directors just saw it was getting out of hand and wanted to avoid looking too biased. They obviously don't want to alienate what little remains of their conservative viewership. Unfortunately, that's just the risk you take for placing truth above neutrality. The irony, by trying to be non-biased, they looked even more biased. The fact checker called them out on this, and it looks like the directors cared more about maintaining peace on set. And honestly, who can blame them for that? When these debaters all have wide viewership to varying degrees, Jubilee really wants to keep the talent happy. They want the good ones to come back and feel like they won't be misrepresented. Yes, I do think there were a few pity points given, which is just evidence that the format itself needs work. So, I left a comment on their video. Yes, I even liked my own comment because I thought it was a very good idea. First of all, they should allow people to clarify their statements, like from the very beginning. don't let the other side divine the arguments for them. Number 2, leave a little bit of room for not rewarding points. You don't need to fact check everything if there's claims that are too broad or lacking in evidence. And number 3, you should maybe change the point system a bit. Stay true to the final checkmate round, I think, where you allow them to wager their own points, which will show the confidence that each side has for their own arguments. And it might help relieve a lot of the pressure off of the fact checkers, I hope. So, my final thoughts on Jubilee as a whole. I think Jubilee pretty accurately represents the way political conversations go on. They're surprisingly more tame than most of the conversations you'll ever find online. I think we're all sick of grifters and people that are only appealing to their own audiences and never get out to debate the other side. We're also all very sick, clearly, of not having people accountable for what they say and being fact-checked live. The surrounded stuff was a very good idea, but it still allowed for too much wiggle room for people to not change their minds and not even be held accountable for spreading misinformation. And ultimately, that's what it's all about. We want to stop all the misinformation that exists in politics and get both sides back to talking to each other like adults, like human beings, and with respect.